The trade tensions between the United States and Canada have escalated into a full-blown trade war with deep economic and political implications. In late 2024, former President Donald Trump unleashed a series of tariffs aimed at Canada and Mexico, accusing them of insufficient efforts in halting illegal immigration and controlling the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. The ramifications have been far-reaching, but what do these tariffs really mean for everyday people on both sides of the border? Could this trade war spell the end of Canada's dominant role in U.S. trade, or is it just another round of political posturing that will ultimately fizzle out? In this video, we'll take a closer look at how this trade conflict is unfolding, the consequences of these tariffs, and the potential impact they will have on both the U.S. and Canada, especially on everyday citizens. In November 2024, former U.S. President Donald Trump made waves on Truth Social by declaring his intention to impose a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico. This announcement was grounded in a twofold justification: national security and a crackdown on illegal immigration. According to Trump, these nations were not doing enough to curb the influx of illegal drugs, especially fentanyl, and their failure to secure the U.S. border directly threatened American citizens. If they can't control their borders, Trump argued, then it's up to us to take action. In response, Canada's trade relationship with the U.S. became a critical issue. In 2024 U.S.-Canada trade was valued at $762.1 billion, with Canada being the U.S.'s largest trading partner. This makes up about $2.08 billion per day in trade. Such tariffs on goods crossing the border could heavily disrupt this massive trade relationship, threatening the economic stability on both sides. The Canadian government immediately responded with condemnation, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calling the tariffs reckless and warning of the economic damage it would inflict on both sides. Canada is the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and this move threatened the economic ties that had been deeply rooted over decades. At this point, the real concern was not just the potential harm to the global trade environment, but also how everyday goods would be impacted. Would Canadians pay more for American-made products? Or would their exports become significantly more expensive for U.S. buyers? In 2023, over 75% of Canada's exports, went to the U.S., including key products like oil, vehicles, and machinery. As 2025 rolled in, the situation worsened. January 2025 saw Trump directing his cabinet to evaluate all potential emergency measures related to illegal migration and drug control. His administration began drafting executive orders that would impose tariffs not just on Canada, but on Mexico and China as well. By early February 2025, Trump had issued an executive order to enforce a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. This had a profound economic ripple effect, as the tariffs also applied to agricultural goods, consumer electronics, machinery parts, and vehicles, all of which heavily depend on cross-border trade. Canada retaliated quickly, imposing its own set of tariffs targeting U.S. products worth approximately $30 billion. The economic impact was immediate. The Canadian dollar began to slide, and consumers saw price increases in everything from cars to food, including products like cheese and cereal items typically imported from the U.S. into Canadian grocery stores. U.S. agricultural exports to Canada were valued at over $27.9 billion in 2023, with soybeans, wheat, and meat products among the top exports. As Canadian and American businesses grappled with the disruption, the broader economy began to feel the strain. Small businesses in rural America that relied on Canadian agricultural imports started facing shortages. In Canada, retailers felt the effects as prices for U.S. goods surged. In February 2025, amid rising pressures, Trump decided to pause the tariffs for a month, signaling a potential de-escalation. This temporary break was seen as a win for diplomacy, but tensions were far from over. Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump agreed to begin talks to avoid further escalation, but the public was skeptical. While both leaders engaged in negotiations behind closed doors, fear gripped the markets. While the Canadian economy has been growing at a steady 3% annually, The potential disruption from tariffs has slowed growth projections to just 1.7% for 2025. At this point, many were asking, what would it take to end this crisis? Would these trade tensions continue to grow, or would they eventually de-escalate? And importantly, what would happen to the cost of living in both countries? Even if the tariffs were temporarily suspended, the fear was that the next round of tariffs could be just around the corner. By March 2025, talks had collapsed, and the full scale of the trade war was unleashed. The U.S. tariffs went into effect, and Canada swiftly retaliated with their own set of 25% tariffs on U.S. goods, especially hitting the agricultural sector and consumer goods. The trade war hit Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia the hardest, as these provinces relied heavily on U.S. exports for industries like automotive manufacturing and agriculture. For instance, in Ontario, where auto manufacturing relies on a complex supply chain from both U.S. and Canadian plants, higher tariffs meant higher production costs. These increased costs were then passed on to consumers, making cars more expensive in the U.S. and everyday items in Canada. According to Auto Data Corp, U.S.-Canada auto trade was valued at over $23.5 billion in 2024 data. For the U.S., the tariffs on Canadian oil and natural gas led to increased energy prices. In 2024, Canada supplied nearly 60% of the U.S.'s crude oil imports, amounting to approximately 4 million barrels per day. A disruption of this supply would lead to increased prices at the gas pump, affecting Americans' daily life. In Canada, retailers saw prices climb due to imported goods becoming more expensive. For example, consumer electronics like smartphones and laptops, often sourced from the U.S., began to increase in price by 5–8%. Tech giant Apple felt the strain, reporting a decrease in sales growth in Canada of 7% in the first quarter of 2025. One of the most striking reactions from Canada came from Ontario, which announced it would impose a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S. This move directly targeted states like Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, which relied heavily on Canadian electricity. Between 2019 and 2024, Ontario's wholesale export prices to the U.S. averaged $41.77 per megawatt-hour. US relies on Canadian power, especially in states like New York and Vermont, where nearly 40% of energy comes from Canadian hydroelectric sources. If Ontario followed through on its threat, it would significantly raise energy prices across the Northeast, hitting both residential consumers and industries that depend on affordable energy to power factories and homes. In March 2025, New York Governor Kathy Hochul warned that any disruption in Canadian power exports could result in blackouts across the state, particularly during winter months, when demand for heating reaches its peak. This would impact everyday life, making utilities unaffordable for low-income households. In the U.S., consumers began to feel the direct impact of the 25% tariffs. Prices for consumer goods, like electronics, clothing, and automobiles, shot up. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, consumer prices in the U.S. rose by 0.5% in the first quarter of 2025, with food costs seeing the sharpest increases. For example, Canadian lumber is a key component in home building in the U.S. In 2024, the U.S. imported nearly $8 billion worth of Canadian lumber. With the new tariffs, these costs began to skyrocket, leading to higher prices for new homes. In California, home buyers saw average prices increase by $15,000 in a typical home in the first few months of 2025. In Canada, the impact on gasoline prices was equally noticeable. As the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canadian oil, gasoline prices surged by 20% in Ontario and Quebec, which rely on imports from the U.S. For Canadians living in rural areas, this translated into higher commuting costs, making daily driving much more expensive. As we move further into 2025, the escalating trade conflict between the U.S. and Canada shows no signs of relenting. With more tariffs on the way, the global trading system could face even more turbulence. The real-world implications for citizens in both nations will continue to evolve, be it higher prices at the grocery store, delays in receiving goods, or even a spike in energy costs during the coldest months. Ultimately, these tariffs are more than just political maneuvering. They have the potential to disrupt everyday life for millions of people. The question remains, how long will this trade war continue, and what will be the long-term effects? Let us know in the comments. How do you think this trade war will affect you in the coming months? And what measures do you think both governments should take to resolve the tensions? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on this developing story. Additionally, battery prices could rise, and this increase would likely be passed down to consumers. For anyone thinking about buying an EV in the near future, these disruptions could delay your purchase or make it more expensive than anticipated. Beyond the immediate impact on consumers and automakers, these tariffs could have a ripple effect throughout the North American economy. For example, if the US and Canada continue their tariff policies, it could increase the cost of manufacturing not just for automakers, but for the broader manufacturing sector as well. As the US depends heavily on imports of raw materials from Canada, this could push up prices across many industries, not just for electric vehicles. The automotive industry in North America contributes over $62.1 billion to the Canadian economy and is a significant employer. The 25% tariff on US-made electric vehicles could have far-reaching effects on over 125,000 Canadian jobs tied to vehicle manufacturing. In 2023, the total trade value between the US and Canada was around $932 billion, and tariffs on vehicles alone account for nearly $30 billion of that total. With these tariffs now in place, the overall cost of goods, from vehicles to steel, could see an increase of up to 10% in prices. In everyday terms, this means that many goods, not just cars, could become more expensive. If the cost of building and shipping vehicles increases, consumers might find themselves paying more for everything from new cars to electronics. Additionally, if the tariff-induced uncertainty causes delays in the production of goods, it could lead to further supply chain disruptions, resulting in shortages and rising prices in everyday consumer products. Despite these challenges, North America's push toward EV adoption is unlikely to slow down completely. Governments are still heavily invested in the green transition, with policies to encourage clean energy, reduce emissions, and promote electric vehicles. In the US, President Biden's government has allocated funds to support the electric vehicle market, including subsidies for EV buyers and investments in battery manufacturing. In 2024, the global electric vehicle market size was valued at $1,328.08 billion, and it's expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate (CAGR) of 32.5% from 2025 to 2030. North America alone saw a 60% increase in EV sales in 2024 compared to the previous year, with 1.4 million electric vehicles sold. The US government has invested over $7.5 billion into EV infrastructure, including charging stations and battery research, and the Biden administration aims to have 50% of all new car sales be electric by 2030. However, these tariffs could create a scenario where automakers and consumers find themselves in a paradox. While the global push toward electrification grows, protectionist measures like tariffs could make it harder for consumers to transition to EVs. Additionally, if automakers are unable to pass on these tariffs without impacting the final price, it could slow the pace at which EVs become affordable and accessible to the average consumer. If you're a prospective EV buyer, you might have to wait longer for incentives and policies to take effect or see higher costs for EVs in the interim. It could also mean fewer affordable options for those who want to transition from gas-powered cars to cleaner alternatives. To sum up, the imposition of tariffs on electric vehicles in North America is a significant setback for the EV transition. While the green movement is gaining momentum across the globe, protectionist policies and trade wars are posing serious challenges for automakers and consumers alike. The rise in EV prices, coupled with supply chain disruptions, could slow down adoption and make it harder for the average consumer to make the switch to an electric vehicle. While government incentives and industry support remain crucial, the current tariff situation could create roadblocks that delay the transition to a greener, more sustainable future. However, it's not all bad news. Governments and automakers are resilient, and many are finding ways to adapt to these changes. As the world shifts toward a clean energy future, we can still hope for solutions that make EVs more affordable and accessible.